Thanks for joining us. So we had a prep call, and we have way more here than we're going to be able to get to. And next time we're going to schedule an hour. But before we jump in, just tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your role there and who you are. And I believe you did postdoctoral work at Bell Labs too. So I don't know. I think I'd like to hear about that as well. But tell us a little bit about yourself.
You'll have to carve out a whole nother hour for me to talk about the postdoctoral and PhD work. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, actually. I worked on melting transitions, a glass of water with ice going to water in 3 dimensions. Wow. It's a phase transition. In 2 dimensions, which is, what's here, like a Post-it, like I've a Post-it, that's a 2-dimensional. In between the solid and the liquid, there's an in-between state. It's like taking a rubber mat and stretching it with a crystal drawn on it. Anyway. Wow. We can spend a whole hour.
Fascinating, yeah.
So I'm very proud to work for MasterCard. Thank you, Josh, for your kind words. It's a company that believes in doing well and doing good. Both are important. And what I do at MasterCard is I run our data and services business. What that means is we help customers, which could be issuers, banks, merchants, governments. We help them make smarter decisions for better outcomes. So we help them, both do well in their businesses using data, as well as and insights that you derive from it, as well as help them better engage with their consumers, whether that consumer is an individual like you or me, or a small business, or a corporation. So that's what we do.
That's great. And give us some scope in regards to the data that MasterCard is processing, even I suppose on a daily basis. It just must be massive, but give us an idea of the scope of that data.
So it is massive. Before I give you the exact number, let me tell you something about our data responsibility principles that govern sort of how we think about our data, right? And we are, by the way, very, very, we adhere to it very strictly, including all the way through COVID. So we collect transactional information when we process a purchase transaction, but it's very, very limited. We know the card number. We know the card number was used at a particular merchant at a particular location. And then we know the date, time, and then we know the total amount.
Right.
So there's a lot that we don't know. So if, for example, if I use my card, we don't know that it was me as an individual, that it was Raj, where I live. We don't even know sort of if I paid for it, and let's say it was $20. We don't know what I bought in those $20. No idea. It could be, a bottle of Tylenol and a pack of Kleenex. We wouldn't know that, right? So it's very limited in what we gather, and we're very focused on data responsibility. But it's a lot that we, when you add up the transactions, we have 2.6 billion cards worldwide. And we have roughly about 87 billion transactions per year. And so what we do is with this really limited data, what we're able to do is aggregate it, anonymize it, use statistical techniques. What I mean by that is we only look at statistically relevant groups of transactions. We never look at an individual transaction. And from that, we're able to derive insights that are quite interesting. And then we can do more than that. So a good example is, our spending pulse, which I think a lot of folks know, which predicts sort of the retail market. Very important right now with COVID-19.
Right.
What spending pulse does is, so all we have is those MasterCard transactions. What Spending Pulse does is says, okay, let's limit it to this retail sector. And then let's take the data and use third-party data and analytical techniques to extrapolate it to total retail spend, which includes all card types. It includes cash. It includes check. It is, the entirety of what a consumer is spending in that retail sector.
Right.
And that gives us all kinds of interesting insights. So I'll give you a couple. We found in April and May, not surprisingly, that share of sales online doubled versus the previous year, not just in the US, but across the globe. We found, and local matters, by the way, there are lots of things that we found. We released this report called Shift to Digital. Recovery Insights is a theme that, we've launched, set of research projects that we've launched, and we published Shift to Digital, more coming, which talks to it. But what also matters with our data is you can go down locally. So we can think about a country, a state, a county, a city, a neighborhood. And that's very helpful. So in this COVID crisis, as an example, you take New York, right? The city. I talked about April, March, very, very tough time for that city. Working with the Partnership for New York as an example, it's a private-public partnership, and their member institutions, we were able to help folks understand exactly what was happening. So you could assess what was going on and figure out how you might react in the New York metro down to the neighborhood level.
Right.
So that's what, listen, the data is powerful, but it's not about the data. It's about the insights and what it tells you and how it informs you, helps you understand, assess, react, and think about what you do.
And, with all that data, and we all know what's happening, whether it's things that that have happened on Twitter in the last few days, we all know about data and security breaches over the past several years. And just talk to us about sort of the state of data and security, right? And how you guys focus on that. And look, I mean, maybe there's no system that is totally impenetrable 100% all the time. But, we're more e-commerce coming up, more people are at home. There are bad actors, it seems like, trying to take us out from a data and security side. What are you doing to prevent that to the best of your ability?
So our services business does focus on security as well. Data, you're spot on. Data breaches, data theft, big issue. Even bigger when you start thinking about digital growing and e-commerce growing, etc. Right? And here, we use an approach at MasterCard in every single business of ours where we take our own MasterCard experience and then try to figure out how we can make that useful to a customer. Right. So that's how we created labs. After we innovated ourselves, we created labs, right? So this is another example where we innovated ourselves. We have a network, a global network we need to keep secure. We need to keep MasterCard transactions secure. We need to keep the digital ecosystem secure. So all the innovation that we did around that, we then have started providing more broadly externally. And it's not one solution, right? It's a combination of several solutions. There's a principle we have called security by design. And what you do is take standards that are out there, leading edge technologies, and you combine them in the right way. And we have a multi-layered approach. It is, if you think about your house, it is analogous, right? There is our first philosophy is prevent. What that means is you put a lock on your front door, right? Our second philosophy is you identify. So before I open that lock and let you in, I want to make sure it's you and not some bad guy, right? Right. And then, third philosophy is detect, which is you might put an alarm system on and try and figure out how you get alerted even when you're not there in the house, watching the front door. So it's a multi-layered strategy. And, in addition to sort of thinking about protecting transactions, we also think about protecting companies. So just like we protect ourselves, right? We think of cyber risk, right? Cyber risk is complicated. You got to look at your technology. You got to look at what you do with your workforce. You got to look at your processes. And so here we've done this again, like we've done many other things, both thinking about what we do ourselves internally, as well as by buying companies, in some cases partners that we use pretty closely already internally. So we bought this company called Risk Recon. It's a MasterCard company, which does an outside vulnerability scan for a company. So outside in kind of tells you where you're vulnerable. And we couple that with our services business and another partner that we bought called Cytegic. We use their software internally. And then we can do an inside out scan to, again, identify the vulnerabilities. And it's under the same umbrella of understanding, what's most impactful, which risk is most impactful to mitigate. So that when you spend $1, you get the most bang for the buck, and you spend it in the right place, and you get the best outcome that you can get as a company, when you spend that money.
And, staying on the security thing, and I do have a bit of a geek out question just on the fly here, but just for some perspective, there was a question that came in here about fraud. Of those 87 billion in transactions, what do you estimate, and I don't know if this is consistent across the credit card companies, is fraud? Is it 1% or 2%, or is it higher? And how's it trending?
So, to answer that question, you'll have to go back and work with the banks, because a lot of, between our technologies, so we have machine learning deployed into our network. Between our technologies that detect patterns that are fraudulent and stop them, and the bank's own techniques, to stop fraud, and the merchants' techniques to stop fraud, the 87 billion is transactions that go through. They're not the transactions get stopped. A lot of transactions get stopped, right?
Right.
And like I said, machine learning, AI, very helpful in this space.
And this is sort of my geek out question that I was thinking about on the fly. You know, you talk about swiping a card or maybe put my chip in, or if I'm on an e-commerce site and I press buy and there it goes. But what about contactless? Like, do you have to, is there an extra layer of security? And I'm not technical at all. So if I sound dumb in asking the question, I apologize. But do you have to do anything different from a security perspective as it relates to contactless types of purchases, whether I'm at a terminal and I just do it, you know, contactless and things like that? Does extra security go into that?
No, so EMV, which is if you want to geek out, right?
Yeah,
which
let's
is
geek out.
you know, the cryptogram standards that we have apply to contactless too. Contactless EMV transactions are just as secure as, you know, physical EMV transactions. Now, contactless, it's interesting you mentioned that, right? That's just the payment. That's the tap and go payment. So let's talk about sort of COVID right now, right?
Yeah.
The contactless has gone from the payment to the entire experience. So we now talk about touchless retail, which is, you know, how do you do the entire purchase without touching anything in this COVID environment? And, you know, it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because for generations, for decades, high touch was the word, right?
Right.
You know, you wanted things to be, you wanted to touch your high priority customers in a high quality way with, you know, very individual in person to person, you know, attention. That was good. In the COVID environment, we've done a flip flop. It's
Right.
actually ironic now that, you know, the fewer people attending to you, the less interaction you have with them, you know, that no touch is now all about, you know, quality, about care, about value. Right. It's kind of, it's funny how it's flipped. So let me give you a kind of interesting story there, Drew. So another customer of ours, this one is a you know, CPG company, came to one of our Seshadri, which is another MasterCard company that
sure.
I know,
we acquired. I know Lars well. Yeah.
You know Lars,
I
yeah,
do, yes,
Lars
absolutely.
is great. Came to Lars in Seshadri, and they wanted to launch their first ever. This is in 2019, first ever at-home hair care product, right? Which meant, you know, they used to design for like virtual consultations and, you know, personalized recommendations remotely. Now COVID hit, and all of a sudden there are no hair salons, right?
Right.
So it's fascinating. It suddenly became much more relevant. It's a, you know, what looked like a niche market became the whole market. And Lars and team, you know, really helped drive engagement and adoption using data, using approaches, understanding the consumer, right? And how to better serve the consumer. And they kicked the numbers out of the ballpark, right?
Right.
Completely blew through their forecasts. So it's interesting. Different environment we're living in.
It is very. So, you know, we just have a couple of minutes left, but I definitely wanted to touch just briefly on AI, machine learning. And, you know, we know AI and machine learning are big buzzwords, and we know companies are using it and all that. So I don't really want to, you know, sort of talk generally about it. I'm curious what you find interesting about artificial intelligence or machine learning in the future, coming down the road. What are you working on now as it relates to AI or ML that excites you, that you think is interesting? We all know it's buzzy and it's being used, but where are the innovations in AI coming for MasterCard?
So it's interesting. It is a buzzword. It's often misunderstood. It's actually a spectrum of analytical techniques. That's really what it is, right? It's not any one thing. You know, we're spending a lot of time thinking about it in many different contexts, right? So let me give you a couple examples. One is, you know, I mentioned data responsibility before. We're thinking about it in the context of data responsibility in our principles. So, you know, you have to be deliberate about what data you use, how you use it, what you use it for, what the purpose is. And what you want to do as you do that is minimize biases, minimize unintended consequences. And what you want to be really careful is you don't want them sneaking into your AI or your machine learning, you know, whatever the bias might be, sampling bias, population bias, whatever the bias might be. You don't want the AI and the machine learning way of doing things to inherit all the biases that are already built into what we do today, right?
And I have a quick question. I don't mean to cut you off, but just curious. When you say minimize bias, how do you do that? Is that actually coders sitting down and coding it in, or using AI to detect bias? I mean, how do you actually, from a either programming or engineering standpoint, how do you minimize bias, literally, you know, in terms of doing it?
Well, it's not as simple as, you know, somebody sitting down and doing it, right? It's a question of thinking about it very systematically from when you design the analysis to all the way through in terms of how you do it. You have to be aware of all the different types of biases as you think about the problem you're solving, the data you're picking, the analytical techniques you're using, right? If you're automating something, what you're automating, it's not simple to do, but
Right.
it's really important to do because you don't want to just inherit those biases
Right.
into what you do.
And is that a programming exercise? Is it a programming exercise?
No, it's not purely a programming exercise. It's also, you need principles, you need, the different categories, you need a lot of analytics, analytical thinking. It's not, it's not simple, but it's super important to do.
Right.
We're actually using AI across the board, Drew, to your original question. So one way we're looking at it, I mean, I can give you lots of examples. One way, as I mentioned, we put machine learning into our network, right? Another example is we're trying to speed up our analytical recommendations and analyses so that it can be sort of more in the moment. The decision making can be informed in the moment. And, the idea here is to make us smarter and faster and save our time so that, so that we can use that time to push the envelope and start doing, other things. Right.
So, before I let you go, I know Josh is going to come on here in just a second.
Hey,
there
Josh.
He is. Before I let you go, just for the audience, I always like to ask, what do you read? How do you stay informed, particularly as it relates to data and innovation? And I'm sure there are probably some obvious publications that you might list, but I'm always interested in maybe some interesting nuggets that people don't know about, an interesting blog or newsletter, or what do you think is the best out there in terms of staying informed on data and innovation and these types of things? What do you read?
So, it's interesting. I read lots of different things. Yeah. But what I will say is it's not as important what you read, but to make sure that you're informed and that you're, you have timely information. Information in itself, like data in itself, is not a competitive advantage for anyone or any company. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, right? What is much more important is how do you think about it? How do you use it? How do you deploy it, right? And that's what I would say. So I could tell you all the things that I read, but I don't think that's the point. Anyone can, read. There's a lot. We are awash in information right now. Yeah. And the edge is not the information. The edge is how do you think about it? How do you use it? How do you apply it? Right.
Well, maybe you should start a newsletter too on data. I'm sure lots of people would read it. Well, I'm going to wrap it there. Hey, Raj, it's great to have this conversation. I hope we get to do it again and maybe in person sometime, maybe in 2021. But thanks for joining us.